Maybe by a brief introduction, my name is Patricia Kroondijk. I'm originally Dutch, but I'm based in Montreux, Switzerland. So I'm not based in Asia, but I've spent um, pretty much the majority of my career working with Japanese corporates. I work with Hitachi, and now I'm with Canon as the corporate venturing director for Europe and the Middle East. Before that, in total, I've spent about 25 years working across a corporate strategy, venture capital or corporate venture capital in this case, and sort of the whole broader innovation spectrum. In the US, actually, I was also lived in Silicon Valley, but now back in Europe. And I travel a lot to Japan. So I know the topic of today was the Asian innovation landscape that we talked about, Nikki, but if it's okay for everyone, I can speak mostly around the Japanese innovation culture because that's really where most of my experience is. And I don't have any slides today, so I want to keep it fairly open and also feel free to jump in. I'm happy to pause and double click on something. So just to kick it off and give a bit of framing. So typically when we think about innovation, we often picture, speed and disruption and these breakthrough technologies and, Silicon Valley launching something new every month almost, it seems. So there's really, really high speed, high velocity, and startups can disrupt something, pretty much overnight. And we celebrate that very bold moves, these fast moves, these failing fast type of concepts. But in Japan, actually, I want to give a very different view because innovation often begins much more quiet. The Japanese culture, especially, it's very much around observation and patience and trust. And I want to make the case today that also this quieter approach might be also a more powerful one, especially in the long run. I've spent, like I said, the last 10 years working with Japanese companies from Europe and the US, and it always struck me how deeply the culture actually shapes their innovation and how they think about even creating it. So their process is really deeply ingrained with their culture in a way. And they have a very different mindset as well. And I had to really adapt to that different mindset, which actually I believe is a competitive advantage. And I'll explain a bit more about that as we go along. So when I first started with the Japanese teams, I was surprised how much time they took in observing. They didn't really act; they were just observing and learning. And they had a very different way of the Western companies that I had worked for, where we trained quite fast, and then we shipped fast, and it was all quite very iterative and very fast moving. But these Japanese innovation teams, they were very different. There was often meetings where there would be no decision or quite a lot of silence actually, and it was hard for me in the beginning. I found it very frustrating. I thought not much was happening. I was working in innovation where we had to either test out new technologies or we had to go find startups to work with. Like it was really much across the whole innovation spectrum. We were making investments in startups, and the world around us was moving very fast, but the world inside was actually quite slow, and it was a really quite difficult and challenging to work with. But then after a little while, once you've had some discussions, it could have been about blockchain or quantum or those were the topics we were looking at a while ago, but then it changed into the energy transition and all sorts of quite complicated topics. But a little while later, somehow these solutions would emerge. Like they had been very considered very deeply by the teams. They often came up with very sophisticated solutions and almost leapfrogged over what I was expecting back. And that would be on the table at that point in terms of maybe a mock-up or already some sort of pilot that was taking shape. And so it was very much around being quite patient to see what would emerge, answering a lot of questions also. They would dig very, very deep before to move on. So all in all, it took a lot of time. But in the end, something emerged that I think was, quite elegant compared to maybe how it would be if we had pushed, the fast sort of Western and type way. And I think that's very much some of the competitive advantage that there is in Japan. There's also a lot of downsides. Like, don't get me wrong, it does move slow, and there's, sometimes momentum is lost and things like that. But I also feel that it's a very much of an interesting way to look at innovation, and it's very interesting to combine both ways, I think. And I wanted to highlight one. I think I would call it a Japanese lens on innovation. In Japan, there's a word. It's called Kisashi, which means the faint signs or signals of what's to come. So it's not really a prediction way. It's almost like a future perception or a future assumption, rather. And it's about noticing these very subtle shifts before they become obvious. And then orienting your strategy around what those shifts might mean, and then not in the next quarter or even the next year, but literally like 10 years from now or decades from now. So it's something that is a very long-term lens on innovation. And Japanese companies, they don't plan in quarters or even years. Like the Japanese companies I've worked for, they plan at a minimum like 3 to 5 years. And sometimes I joke because sometimes they plan like generations, because some of my innovation work, I was looking at 2050 or 2060, for example, for quantum. But they, they are willing to look that far out, and it shows up concretely still in strategic choices that they make in the short term, which might look a bit strange. That might not really fit exactly with the short term, but when you look at that long-term view, it actually makes a lot of sense. And so they are very good at looking very far out and then backcasting, as they call it, backcasting to today, to see what needs to happen today in order to get like that far out in the future, in this imaginary world, right? Because it gets really hard to project and predict things after the next 1 or 2 years. So yeah, so for example, it's not a company I worked for, but Toyota, they already started the research on the hydrogen like 30 years ago. And so before it became like really mainstream now. So maybe at the time it looked like expensive or, like a distraction. But today it looks like, foresight. They had good foresight. We had the same thing with Hitachi, where Hitachi already invented a quantum computer that we started working with in 2016, but they had already started working on quantum like in the early 2000s as well. And, they are now sort of predicting that some of their quantum computers might not become commercial until 2050. And they are fine with that. They still have their R&D teams, they have people working on it. And so they believe in that vision and that future, and they put resources behind it, and they slowly sort of gradually work towards that. And also at the time I was like, oh, quantum computers, really? But it's so far out. Why would we work on that? But if you think back of the innovations that we're using today, many of those were also invented 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So maybe those are two examples. And that's what I find really fascinating about this Kisashi concept. It's not really about having much better data or smarter analysts or anything like that. It's almost like I have, as an innovation director, I have the cultural permission from the company to take this really long-term view and to take it seriously, and to even be able to put resources behind, what the team believes, and where we place some of the very strategic bets, even when some of the signals are not that clear yet. It's not like an industry with momentum or anything like that, and the market has maybe not confirmed it yet. So it's also risky, right? I mean, you can place the wrong bets, but it does require this very patient, like from the organization itself, like this organizational patience that I haven't seen much in the Western organizations that I've worked with, or that at least don't get rewarded that as much as they do in the Japanese companies that I've worked for. And also, I think a lot about this, like Kisashi, now that I'm more on the venturing side, and less maybe on the R&D innovation side. But we talk about this pattern recognition. What's the next unicorns coming, or what's the next wave? And you can clearly see some of these waves coming potentially, but if you don't have the patience to work towards that, especially when you move further out in the future, it's actually just noise. And so quite enjoying this long-term vision to work with in the innovation field and venture, even though it might take a little bit more time. So that's the Kisashi concept that I find fascinating, and I wanted to share with you today. And then there's this other concept that I think is really very important and underlying in the whole Japanese innovation culture, very much on the, let's say, innovation design side. But it's built around this very deep philosophy around trust. It's another Japanese word. It's called anshin. It's almost like more like peace of mind and the feeling of safety that comes from like a system or a product or like a relationship that won't let you down. It's really like intentional design, I would say. And so Japanese designers and innovators, they don't just build for the function, like functionality or cost, but they also very much build for this type of trust that they would like to see. And I think that's why you see such amazing quality in Japanese products. I live in Switzerland now, and it's like very similar the way they look at quality. It's extremely high. So, for example, when I was working for Hitachi in the US, we were selling elevators, but actually, we were not able to sell elevators in the US because we were too expensive, because our elevators were aligning with the floor, like on the the nano centimeter. But the elevators in the US, yeah, they had sometimes a gap, and they were willing to cut the corners there, and that was fine, and that's also fine. It's kind of a level of quality that was not necessary. And it was the same thing for our trains. We were entering the US market with our train business at the time, and we were trying to sell those trains in the US. But something became clear very quickly, that the product was really not matching what they needed in the US, because in the US, the trains are built to crash. So you have these huge locomotives in the front. I don't know if you've seen the US trains, but they're massive, the locomotives in the front. And they're built because they might crash. And so they need to be very heavy. But Japanese trains, they're actually built to not crash. And they're built for speed, and they're very lightweight. So the Hitachi trains would never survive a crash in the US. So that all had to change. So it's very different logic sometimes in how products get built or services get built. And so it's very, very interesting, this level of trust that they put in their products, but also in society. So maybe some of you have visited Tokyo, but there's a lot of small, like day-to-day things. Like, for example, it's very complex, the metro system. So it's very easy if you buy a metro ticket, but yeah, you get on the wrong train and then you end up somewhere really far. So you underpaid your train fare, which is that's quite easy to do actually. At the exit, they have like a very small machine, very like not so obvious, but they don't like trigger an alarm or like trap you in the gates, which I've had in Paris, where I lost my ticket. I was trapped between these two gates and I couldn't get out. But there's actually like a really non-obtrusive way to sort of pay your dues and pay what the difference was, and then walk out, and there's no confrontation and it's no penalty. and there's no assumption that you are trying to cheat. The assumption is that you want to do the right thing. And the system is designed to help you comply and not to catch you treating. So it's a very different way of looking at the systems and the design logic. So they design very much that you are going to do the right thing and not so much designed for the exception of the worst case user or something like that. So yeah, even in their systems, there's not a it's very trustful society. Of course, there's fraud clearly, and that might be one of their weaknesses in the coming years. But definitely, that's something that over centuries has sort of been there. Um, so yeah, that's the other concept that I wanted to share, this like unseen, this foundation of trust. Um, so it's also that people really collaborate sort of very openly and they think long term without fear. That's the Kisashi. And so Japanese innovation, it's also very much about harmony. Sometimes that's even in some of the cultural values. You see the word harmony a lot. And I think the fundamental difference is very much that innovation is not necessarily about the disruption, like for its own, like really for its own sake or disrupting things, but it's very much around alignment and collaboration. So either alignment with society or alignment with technologies or even between organizations. So it has almost the existential kind of purpose is very, very different, I feel, and it trickles through in the way that we look at innovations and where we invest also. So maybe one of the examples I can give as well is that there's this it's another train example. I love trains, but I used to work for Hitachi and we had a really big train business. So there's this example where Hitachi was working on these really fast trains. I don't know if you've seen them. It's called the Shinkansen bullet trains, and they're very, very fast. And the first trains, when they came out, they were quite making quite a loud sound when they were coming out of the tunnel. And so it wasn't very comfortable for the passengers on the train. It was almost like a boom. And then, they sat with that for a little while. They didn't rush into the engineering side or anything like that. And then one of the engineers actually, he was also a bird watcher, and he took the observation of this kingfisher bird. It's a bird with a really long beak that dives like almost like vertically into the water, and it barely makes a splash. And so with that sort of observation, that actually became the solution. So the nose of the train is now very, very distinct. It's this really long nose. I don't know if you've seen the train, but that's redesigned, for the noise reduction, and then the speed improved and everything else. And it's just because this person was really just also paying attention, to established natural kind of options to redesign things. So a very, very cool example, I thought, because they were just paying attention to even some of the other non-engineering, let's say, options that they have. Then at Hitachi also we had, I don't know if you know, but Japan is the fastest aging population in the world. I mean, they have this really old population in general, and probably know the examples of Okinawa where they've studied all these centenarians. But in general, actually, the Japanese population is the fastest declining in the world, and it's pretty challenging for them. They can't really rely or they can't count on the same level of workforce and people that they will have in the future, because also immigration is quite low, and birth rates are extremely low, but they don't necessarily treat it as like a burden for society, which I think we would do at least in Europe. But they've really designed robots, for example, to help in dementia care. And they've also at Hitachi, we had this like really cute looking mini Alexia device that was there to remind elderly to take their magic medication or to have even like a empathetic discussion with. And initially I thought, oh wow, this it's interesting, but really these technologies, it's not like super efficient. And we were spending a lot of research on how to make robots empathetic, which I think now it's really, really interesting. But this is like 15 years ago, and these technologies, they're not, yeah, they were really built for the dignity of the elderly and really geared towards this alignment with, what was happening to the population there. And it wasn't really built for efficiency, and there was a lot of R&D dollars spent on it. But I think that's an important distinction because it wasn't always like the pure business case that they were following, but it was also very much about where is society going to be in Japan. We're all going to age. There's a lot of elderly people there, so we need to do something about it. And I think that's also very interesting that it's not always directly coming from, a specific business case or ROI, but it's very much coming from this future scenario that they have envisioned. Even now at Canon, where I work now, so Canon, you probably know from the cameras and the printers. So that's what they're known for. But we invested actually in a company recently that's producing specialized food only for the elderly. So whether it's like easier to swallow, but there's also nutrition in there that is specifically designed for elderly, and like different ways, like soups and things like that. So now we're supporting a food company, which is very different than the original cameras and printers. But it's not even adjacency; it's like completely different. But the way that my company looks at it is like, look, okay, people are aging in Japan. What does this population need that no one is building, or now someone is building it that we can support? And so again, this Kisashi is applied, and I think the concept of conglomerate is really, really present in Japan. So you can see these companies that have evolved from, electronics into trains, into energy, they let these kinds of Kisashi and foresight also lead them to very non-adjacent areas, which I find fascinating. And they just really follow that scenario, and they're not overly concerned about the fact that it's not close to their core. And so I think that's one of the interesting moves also that we've been tasked with now as an innovation team at Canon is they've actually specifically asked us, don't look at the printers and the cameras, but look at what else our society might need and what would really, really matter. So not only what we can sell, but what do they need? And maybe a really small example is when I was drawing some slides long time ago, and we would build like these business model slides, and we would have usually we would have something like what our solution was, and then maybe a bit of the architecture and the partners, and then on the bottom we had like the customer segments. And then I got a comment from one of the executives, and he said to me, actually, Patricia, we never place our customers at the bottom of the slide. We always place them at the top of the slide. And I think that just reflects their whole way of thinking, is that they do so much in service of the customer or society. And anyway, that's a small anecdote, but I think it illustrates a bit this whole concept that I've been talking about. So yeah, these are the two concepts I wanted to share: the Kisashi one and Anshin one. Yeah, in closing, maybe just a few side notes is that, and by the way, I probably don't have a full hour, but I'm hoping there will be some questions as well we can dig into. But Japan is definitely not a role model. It's not the perfect model. the cultural conditions that this Kisashi and Anshin that took centuries to develop. Japanese companies tend to move very slow, so they are very patient, but I also need to be quite patient in that sense working for these companies. So it takes a certain patience across the board. I also don't think you can import, or you shouldn't import, exactly this way of looking at innovation for Western companies, but I think you can borrow some of the questions or take a different point of view sometimes by using some of those maybe signals that you've seen, or to give yourself permission to look a bit further ahead into the future, or to backcast from a certain moment in the future and not only the next year. Also think about this trust thing of how that might be reflected in the systems that are designed in our organizations, where we look for people to fail or commit fraud versus the other way around. So what could be designed to help people succeed, or at least adjust or something like that. And also in our own planning, a lot of the challenging problems right now, they will not take 1 or 2 years. They will literally might take some decades. So if we're planning in quarters, what problems are we really solving, or would that still fit in with the longer term picture? I know that's hard to carve out time for in organizations that don't appreciate maybe that longer term view, but it's very worthwhile doing it, not on a monthly basis, but once a year or something like that. And I look a lot at that in my own work, like what signals are coming at me, just to notice them, to note them down. Like, is this something I should watch? Does it matter? What kind of picture could I paint from this? So that's something that a lot of my Japanese colleagues, they're doing that instinctively. I can see that. And so, yeah, I had to adjust a little bit and really carve out some time for that. So I keep my eyes open on the long term, let's say. And the other thing for me is that I had to really adjust my pace. And so for me, innovation right now, it's like it's not a race to be like the first mover advantage or anything like that. For me, it's very much like a continuous rhythm that I'm working with. And I think if you can build a rhythm like that, I don't know if you're in innovation, but if you can build an innovation rhythm, where it's a bit more patient, maybe where you can look a little bit more calmly, or at least stop and pause and reflect on some of the questions you're trying to answer. I can see that those systems are quite resilient, because whatever comes then next, you just follow again that rhythm. So it's not a big, let's say, boom, and it's a big drain also on the organization, but it's really like it's a more natural rhythm that I'm now part of, I would say, than when I was doing some other innovation work, more ad hoc and intense, which was also fun, by the way. I learned a lot from it. But yeah, those were my reflections when Nikki asked me, can you speak about the Asian innovation landscape? So I'll leave it here, and happy to have some questions and open it up for the group to discuss.